Welcome, folks. We are going to get started with today's webinar. Super excited about kicking this one off today. Thanks so much for joining us from wherever you are in the world. My name is Jeff Gothelf, and with me today is Nicole Rufuku. Nicole, are you with us?
Yes, I am. I was in the process of putting myself back on video. Thanks for
Excellent. Good to see you. Welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Super excited to be here with Nicole. I've had the pleasure of knowing Nicole for a very long time, and I'm super excited to be hosting this webinar here today. We're going to talk about applying 3 core principles of innovation to improve your hiring process. And that is the well, it's not, I was going to say it's the subtitle of Nicole's new book, but it's kind of a broadening of the title. But Nicole's got a new book on Sense and Respond Press, which we're super excited about. It's called Hiring for the Innovation Economy, 3 Steps to Improve Performance and Diversity. And in fact, the book is now available for pre-order. So if you went to bit.ly/Nicole Rufuku, R-U-F-U-K-U, you will be able to pre-order the book, and then it's going live in just a couple of weeks, but it's up there right now. For those of you who are familiar with Sense and Respond, or those of you who are not, Nicole's book is part of a bigger series of books that we've been publishing over the last year or so. As you can see on the next slide, Nicole is part of a series. We've got Debbie Madden's book, Hire Women. That was our last webinar that just came out. Making Progress by Ryan Jacoby has been out for a while, as has Lean versus Agile versus Design Thinking, a book that I wrote, and then Tim Herbig's Lateral Leadership, which is a book for product managers on how to influence others who you don't have authority over, is actually up for pre-sale as well up on Amazon at the moment, with the rest of the books actually in progress. But today we are here to talk about Nicole and really let Nicole share her wisdom with us. Nicole has spent her career in tech, starting out at Microsoft in product strategy. Worked together with Nicole at Neo Innovation, where Nicole had engagements from ideation to scale for startups, the enterprise, and even a nonprofit. During her career, Nicole has also co-founded 3 startups, an experience that taught her that sometimes building teams is harder than building products. True. She's now using and applying the tools she picked up building products to help teams fix their hiring processes at a consultancy that she runs called Bonsai Hiring. Nicely done, Nicole. I'm going to hand off to Nicole here in just a second. She's going to share a presentation with you for about 15 minutes, and then we are going to come back and just do a Q&A with the folks who are currently attending the webinar with us today. So a couple things here. First of all, there is a Q&A module in the webinar user interface. Please put your questions in there. That allows me to see them and to mark them as complete and so forth. So please do put your questions in the Q&A module. If you put them in the chat, I'll see them, and that's okay. But if you could put them in the Q&A module, that would be great. And the second thing I wanted to point out before I stop talking and let Nicole do the talking is that we do have a hashtag for this. If you're tweeting about this webinar, the hashtag is Hire4Innovation. And it's the word for, not the number 4, despite strong lobbying to the contrary. I've opted for Hire4Innovation with the word 4. Okay. Last thing, really quick, is we are recording this webinar, and we are going to post it online on Sense and Respond Press's YouTube channel. And so pay attention to the Sense and Respond Press Twitter account. We'll post it there. We'll tweet about it once this is live, so you can share it with your colleagues and see it again later. Okay, I've talked too much. Nicole, take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. So thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be doing this webinar with you. I've enjoyed the other ones you've done. And thank you also for the work that you and the rest of the team at Sense and Respond are doing in creating this book series. I think, you know, it kind of supports everything I believe in that the content is really short. It's straight to the point. It cuts out the fluff, and it really respects the time that the modern manager does not have. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing there, and I'm really proud to be a part of it, and I'm honored that you've given me this platform.
Awesome. We're psyched to have you on board.
So let's just dive in. I'm just gonna get right to the point. So what I want to talk about today is, is kind of based on this belief that I have that the traditional interview is dead. And the first thing I think we need to do is kind of define what the traditional interview is. And we have all been a part of these, probably on both sides of these traditional interviews. So the types of interviews that we're all accustomed to are those interviews where it's very conversational, very ad hoc, very freestyle, and these are characterized often by hiring managers asking questions like, tell me about yourself and walk me through your resume. So this type of interview is highly ineffective, and we're going to talk about all the reasons why it's ineffective. But before we continue, I actually want to take a moment to kind of define a couple things. One is that, I'm going to be talking about hiring and interviewing, but although I'm focused on kind of helping people improve the hiring process broadly, I'm laser focused on the interview process. So that's going to be what we really focus on today. So just so there's no confusion, and then I'll go right into all the reasons why hiring is broken and why the interview process specifically is broken, because we don't have a ton of time. So these are three big reasons that I've experienced, but also three big areas where kind of the research proves that the traditional interview process and the traditional interview structure is really broken. So the three areas, the three kind of outcomes of the traditional interview process is that they increase legal liability for teams and for companies. They create bias, which leads to a lack of diversity, especially in spaces like technology, and most importantly, it just leads to bad hires and poor performance for the hiring teams. So what the data shows is that cases of hiring discrimination have gone up in recent years. And in 2005, I think the average payout for a company that was proven to be practicing hiring discrimination was around $200K. And then in terms of bias, the traditional interview, the unstructured conversational interview that we just described, consistently shows at least 20% bias. So against women and minorities. So women and minorities end up scoring 20% lower than their peers. And then in terms of bad hires, of course, it ends up hiring somebody who's a bad fit and who's a poor performer hurts your team in the end. But this has actually been quantified, and so what the studies have shown is that it could end up costing your team about 2 to 3x that person's salary. So we know that the impact, could be cultural. It could be an impact that affects your clients. So it's really far-reaching and significant. So next, I kind of want to talk about the innovation principles that we're going to cover today, and specifically, I want to emphasize innovation principles because that's my background, and that's where I've pulled these principles for hiring. And these principles are specifically for teams and companies who have innovation as their kind of central goal. So for teams and companies who are creating products and services for the future, these principles are going to be really familiar to you. If that's not what you're focused on, then these principles might not speak to you at all, and that's okay. But if innovation is one of your team goals or one of your company goals, these principles are fundamental to your performance, and they should be really infused into everything you do as a company, all processes beyond product development. And so what I want to emphasize here is don't forget hiring, right? So innovation, these principles should be a part of your sales process, a part of your operations process, but don't forget about the hiring process, which is so critical to your success. So the 3 principles I want to cover today, and these will look very familiar to you if you're in the world of innovation, is collaboration, data-driven decision-making, and customer-centric experiences. So let's start out with collaboration. So the thing that I tell all clients and teams is that hiring is a team sport. What we're used to doing, I think, as hiring managers is we start the hiring process alone and we end it alone. So we create this, this job description by ourselves or maybe with HR. And then, after a quick conversation with the hiring team, we end up making this decision about hire, no hire by ourselves. And it kind of weighs on us whether or not, the team member we've chosen is successful or not. And what I want to emphasize is, in the world of product development, we've learned that bringing a well-curated cross-functional team together to make decisions always ends up yielding better results. And so why don't we apply that to the hiring process? And of course, I'll show you a tool that I use to do that a little bit later on. In terms of data-driven decision-making, I think, what I've seen is that just from talking to companies, HR executives and hiring managers, is that, whenever there's a lack of process in interviewing or in hiring in general, people kind of, fill the gap with their own ideas or with their own approaches. And that's okay, but those things become, they become really stylized and really personalized. And so what happens is that we start to think of hiring and interviewing specifically as an art instead of a science. And the reality is that, when we do that, we end up, falling back on our favorite interview questions that may or may not be relevant to the actual job. But, we forget that there actually is a right way to do these things. And there's a lot of data starting, in even like the 60s and 70s about how to conduct hiring in a way that is actually effective. So this is something that that I think is kind of a crucial mental shift that's often difficult for people to make, but that is absolutely central and critical. The next big shift I encourage is thinking about your job candidates as customers. And so as a product person, as somebody who's kind of grown up on product teams, we become obsessed with our customers, right? With our users. And what I challenge hiring managers to do is to really think about your job candidates as your most important customers. And so if you think about the bigger picture, these job candidates are actually more critical to your success than any customer, than any shareholder, than any other executive that doesn't actually, that may not actually, touch customers and products. So we really need to be, I think we need to think differently about the way that we approach job candidates. Oftentimes I see job candidates approached in kind of an adversarial way. And, what would happen if your team actually started thinking about these job candidates as their most important customers? And I think the shift that you would see is pretty profound. So let's dive into some practical solutions. I want to talk about star mapping for a 4-point hiring scale and a candidate journey. I'll be very brief on all of them. But for collaboration, I've created a tool that I call star mapping. And this star mapping tool really focuses on creating balance in the hiring process so that you make sure to hire for hard skills, for soft skills, and then also for perspectives and diversity. And so, if you look at this, this is an example for a social media manager. This is a board that a team has theoretically already filled out. But this is designed to bring a team together and help you guys brainstorm across these 3 different pillars. Tools is for hard skills, agility is for soft skills, and dimensions is really about perspective, but also and it includes diversity perspectives as well. And so the team comes together and you all brainstorm the different attributes that could fall into these three pillars for each new hire you want to bring into your company. And so eventually what you want to do as a team is you want to come together to not just brainstorm, but also to prioritize all of these different attributes so that you end up with 3 in each column, and those are the 9, and so you end up with a total of 9 hiring factors. And those hiring factors you use to create your job description, you use them to create your recruiting strategy, and eventually you use them to actually evaluate and compare the different job candidates that you bring in. And so this is really a tool to bring people together, to have a conversation, to challenge each other. And this is actually extremely powerful when you think about bias. What I've seen teams do is when they're in the conversation of actually prioritizing these different attributes, they really challenge each other about what actually matters to the success of the job candidate. And so they end up removing a lot of attributes that are biased or that are irrelevant. And so this is a place where I see hiring managers really get excited, and they're often surprised by what other people bring into the process. And this is something that could take 30 minutes once your team knows how to do this. And you only need to do this every time you have a completely new position, right? So you don't have to come together to do this session every single time, but you should when you have a new position to fill or when a position changes significantly. And this is what it looks like in the wild. So, so this team has kind of, put up a board. They've kind of brainstormed a bunch of attributes. You can see them kind of talking about what they value and what they don't, and then they end up prioritizing, just a handful of attributes that they agree is the most important for hiring. Next, we're going to talk about data-driven decisions, and for this one, this is a really, really cool tool that I'm super excited to share with you guys. So this is the 4-point hiring scale. So the research has shown that if you use a scale like this, and we've kind of all seen like 5-point scales and star ratings for measuring the success of a meal or other things, but this is really for the interview process. And I've taken it down from 5 points to 4, so that people really are forced to make a decision about whether or not they want to hire someone. So the way that you use this is that, after you interview somebody, you rate them, you give them 3 points, 2 points, 1 point, or 0 points, and then you total the points across the interview process, and then you make a hiring decision as a team based on the points that the person has received. And the great thing about this scale is that, first of all, if you just do the points period with like no definition, because you can see that I've attached definitions to each of these 4 levels. If you do this without attaching the definitions, you will still see a decrease in bias, and that's what the research shows. If you label each point of the scale and make sure that everybody on your team really understands and really discusses, what does a strong hire mean, and what do we mean by no hire, and what do we mean by strong no hire. If you really take the time to do that, and then you rate somebody after they answer each question, so that you have a series of ratings for each interview, and then you total the score at the end of the interview. That process will actually bring hiring or bring bias to near zero. So lots of studies have shown that, and so this is a super powerful tool. And so I encourage you guys to use it as soon as you can. Start rating people in your interviews. This is a great way also to establish a trail of documentation, to make sure that you're holding yourselves accountable. You know why you're making your hiring decisions. You make notes around why you're giving people a certain number of points. This is a really great way to make sure that you're you're staying honest. And then in terms of creating a customer-centric experience, I'm just going to show you this really quick example. So you can actually look at the bottom here is a hiring journey for a job candidate. And so, you can actually analyze the way that a job candidate travels through your hiring process, and analyze the different places where you might be weak or strong, and what you want to analyze for is potential bias. You want to analyze for areas where you're making decisions and they're not data driven, but also the areas where you could potentially infuse company values, and the areas that might be hurting your hiring brand. So there are things like not communicating with your job candidates that may be hurting your hiring brand and potentially hurting your reputation, that you need to pay attention to. But this is a process that you can do as a team and really understand, where is the opportunity and where are the risks in our hiring process. And that's all I've got for now, and I will stop sharing.
You should never stop sharing, Nicole. You have much wisdom to share. Listen, that was great. And thank you. Thanks so much for that. Questions, folks, don't forget, if you've got questions to ask Nicole, please drop them in the Q&A module. A couple of questions are starting to come in over there. That was good. Let me start by asking you a couple of questions about this, Nicole, and really kind of get your take on this. So you described this hiring system for teams and for hiring managers. I guess my immediate reaction, hearing this is, isn't this HR's job, or isn't this HR work? Like, don't we pay people to do a better job at this than just us? Or where do you so I guess the real question is, where do you see the responsibility for the ideas that you just shared with us falling?
Yeah, I think this is different across different teams, but what I encourage teams to do is really take ownership of the hiring process and use HR as a support system, right? So HR is really well equipped to, look for different tools for you and like support you where you need it. But the fact is, in the end, whoever you hire is going to impact your team and your performance. And so why not take ownership of it and really create an experience that aligns with your vision for your team, your culture, and everything else, and use HR as a really powerful resource, but as a resource that may not be the best position to like advocate for your team, who you are, and what you want to accomplish.
Got it. So essentially what you're saying is, maybe, but if you're the people who have to live with these decisions.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
own the process, be a part, be active in it, and make sure you get the best folks for your team. That's great.
Right.
Question: how does this process help align new hires with team culture?
Oh, yes, that's a really, really good question. So, the interesting thing is that, you know, when I encourage teams to think about the hiring process as a customer experience, part of that experience should be to help job candidates actually get to know your team and get to know your culture as they progress through the hiring process, right? So they should not begin to learn about your culture on day one, on their first day, right? So the hiring journey should really be a place where you build on the story of your team, and you give the every touch point you have with a job candidate is an opportunity to tell them about, you know, what you value and how you work. So by the time they walk through the door, they're already pretty comfortable with what they're getting into, and they already have a sense of who you are.
Well, I mean, so just digging just a little bit deeper into that one. So, um, sadly, perhaps I've been on a lot of job interviews in my career, and you know, some of them do go on 3, 4, 5 rounds, and they'll drag on into multiple weeks and that type of thing.
We can talk about that too.
Yeah, we can. Well, good, we should. But you know, the interesting thing is, and again, anecdotally speaking, the only thing I seem to have learned in those experiences was that these folks take forever to hire or make a hiring decision, right? And so what specific? So my question is, what specific tactics, or what would you know, if I'm coming in for one of these conversations, for one of these interviews, what are things that we can do during the process to truly expose the candidates to the culture, and then what are we looking for as we're exposing them to the cultures to make sure that they will or will not fit?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, you know, how we can expose our candidates to the culture, I
Mm-hmm.
think first of all, you should not do that by adding or extending the interview process. If you extend it past 4 interviews, then honestly, you're not sure what you're interviewing for. And so you're trying to kind of solve for that confusion by just gathering more and more data. But in my sense, if you're getting to 5, 6 rounds, it's not clear what you're not clear on what you're searching for. So let's not add conversations to help people kind of get to know the culture. But you can do other things, like you can, you know, send a follow-up email that has a link to a video about something about your culture, right? Like you can I don't know. It's really up to teams to think about how to thoughtfully share themselves.
Yeah.
And tell their story. So it's hard for me to kind of come up with those ideas, but I think teams have to get creative about how you bring people into this process in a way that doesn't necessarily just take up their time and ask more of them. And I think the other thing in terms of, you know, making sure that people are kind of right for your culture is allowing them the space to engage and ask questions. So what usually happens for like a traditional interview is that you come in for an hour, and then you're kind of grilled for 15 minutes, and then hopefully you get 10 minutes to ask your own questions. And what I advocate for is teams getting so clear about what they're looking for that they spend 30 minutes asking questions, and then they give the candidate 30 minutes back to ask questions of their own. Mm-hmm. And so what that does is, first of all, it focuses the conversation. Second of all, it allows you to have the kind of like back and forth that will probably give you more data about whether or not this person is truly interested, truly excited, and really the right person for the job. But of course, you want to give people kind of a heads up that you're doing that, so they're not taken aback and they don't, they haven't taken the time to prepare questions. But 30 minutes for them to ask you questions is a really, really great way to respect their time, but also respect the investigation they need to do.
Got it. Cool. Question from the audience. Do you have any specific recommendations for platforms that allow you to utilize these concepts that capture data for future decision making? So are there tools or platforms? I'm guessing the question is, are there platforms that can leverage the system that you just described to capture data so we can make decisions in the future?
Gosh, this is a really good question. And I know it's a good question because I don't have an answer for it. So I don't have any great recommendations. What I've seen teams do is just kind of create Google spreadsheets. I will soon be working on some tools based on these like really easy frameworks that I've created. But I encourage teams to kind of build their own templates too, and share them out with the rest of their team, but also their companies. Google has actually done an interesting job of creating a lot of tools for hiring, and I recommend you guys read the book Work Rules by Laszlo Bock, and he outlines some of the tools they've created, and I think it's great for teams to kind of customize their own toolkits. But I think the issue with platforms and tools and technology for hiring for solving these problems is that these are fundamentally people problems that aren't going to be fixed with technology. And so, a lot of times, I think if you take the time to figure out what works for your team first, and then try to find a tool, that's kind of the best way to approach it. But honestly, Google Docs templates and spreadsheets are probably the best place for you to start.
Yeah, it's amazing how flexible those tools can be.
Yeah.
And look, and they become, ultimately, if they prove valuable and you're scaling these hiring practices to hundreds, if not thousands of candidates, then maybe that's justification for actually building some software and automating the tool.
Exactly. And whenever I work with teams, I give them templates, but they're always like Google Docs templates. And the reason why is because I'm still kind of, refining and figuring out what works for people, but also teams need to customize them themselves, right? So they all have different hiring needs, and they should kind of take ownership and figure out like what doesn't work for them and make the tweaks as needed.
Got it. Okay. Next question from the audience. What are some strategies for evaluating dimensions, diversity, perspectives, etc.?
Honestly, I think simple conversations, but I think you just have to get really specific about the types of dimensions you're looking for, and the way I would think about dimensions is, if you take a look at your team and where you are in the marketplace that you're playing in, think about the dimensions that would give your team an edge. The perspective that you're missing today that would give your team an edge. And so, when we think about diversity, we definitely think about it as demographic, and that's really important. But think about also, potentially, language and community knowledge and knowledge and understanding or empathy towards people with disabilities, or it really depends on the space that you're in, and where you think that, how you think that space is going to evolve over time, who your customers are, and what is currently missing on your team that is going to help you better understand your customers today, but also your customers tomorrow. And, because there can be so many different types of dimensions, I've seen teams add dimensions like, must have an understanding of our local community, or or must have experience designing products for, people who are hard of hearing, so it's really, the evaluation is going to be according to the types of dimensions that you identify and prioritize as a team. Yeah.
There was a long time ago, I met an executive coach, and sometimes the executives that he was coaching would ask him to evaluate other executives that they were considering hiring. And what he would do is he would take that candidate to a middle tier restaurant, nothing like, not a McDonald's and nothing, Michelin star, but something in the middle. And he would just observe how that candidate would treat the staff, the hostess, the bus boys, the waitresses, whoever they came in contact with. And for him, that was a clear proxy for how he would treat his own employees, right? To get a good sense of how he thinks about people who essentially are serving him at a restaurant,
right.
Which is a really interesting tactic. And so I wonder if there's something there where, if you're if you're building a product for a particular community, or you're operating in a particular community, simply circulating with that person in that community, just kind of watching how they behave, how they react, how they engage or not, may give us some signals.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it really depends on what you're measuring for, and, what I want to stress is that, you do kind of want to create a process where that is like very consistent from candidate to candidate. That's part of what's going to reduce the bias in your hiring process. And so, if you take somebody out to a restaurant or to a bar to evaluate something specific, then you want to do that for all of the different candidates, but you want to be really explicit about what you're measuring, right? So people often do that, but they tend to implicitly be, measuring for whether or not this is a good person, with morals or something like that, and then that's all kind of, subjective and difficult to maintain, across different candidates. So you could imagine a scenario where you're hiring for somebody who has an appreciation for art, right? So maybe in that scenario, you would ask them to talk about 3 different pieces of art that they care about. So it's really about what you're measuring for and adapting the evaluation and the tools that you use and the format you use for evaluation based on what you are evaluating, right? So it's not going to be right for everyone to go to a restaurant or to go to a bar. And so that's a mistake that people often make is trying to evaluate personality. And maybe when it's not relevant, right? It might be relevant for a CEO who's going to be interacting with, whose primary job might be people management, but it's not going to necessarily be important for every type of hire. And so we need to be aware of those inconsistencies and be kind of, explicit about what we're doing and why.
Yeah, it reminds me that ridiculous question they always put up during U.S. presidential elections. Who's the candidate you most want to have a beer with?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like,
exactly.
Ridiculous.
Why does this matter?
Right. Why? Exactly. Okay. Little bit of a direction shift. Another question from the audience here. But given your entrepreneurial background, I think you'll appreciate this question. What's your advice for a startup founder that is just starting a company and needs to hire?
Yeah, so this is really, this is really, really important because as a startup founder, your first few hires are going to basically define your culture like moving forward. Yeah. So it's really, really critical for you. And so what I would recommend is going through the star mapping process. If you're a founder by yourself, then it's harder to do that. And so in that situation, I would pull in maybe an advisor or somebody else who knows the space, or someone you trust and who you think is a reflection of the type of company you want to build. And do the star mapping process and really get down to, 3 hard skills, 3 soft skills, and 3 kind of, 3 dimensions that you're looking for in each person that you're hiring for. And really acknowledge the fact that those 9 factors for each of those hires is going to kind of, dictate the evolution of your culture. But the important thing is that you're going to be doing this consciously, whereas other, I think, founders kind of are more instinctive about it, and that can work, but it can also lead to kind of catastrophic mistakes. So I mentioned earlier that a new hire can cost you 2 to 3 times their salary. I would venture to guess, and I don't have the data to prove this, but I would venture to guess that for a founder making their first few hires, that cost is well beyond that. And so really take the time to define who you're looking for, define what you're looking for. Don't just hire people who are kind of just close to you in the network or who've been recommended to you, because that's kind of how you build in bias right away. And so I would encourage you to use the star mapping process, and then get out of your own network. That is probably rule number 1 for creating like a diverse team with wide perspectives. Get out of your own network. Don't just go talk to somebody that was referred by a close friend or a former coworker. Go beyond your network. Really put in the effort to meet people that you haven't, the types of people you haven't worked with before. And I think if you start out with a team that's already diverse, you're going to kind of feel the impact of that right away, and you're going to feel the fact that your team probably has a much bigger perspective on the marketplace than your competitors.
Kind of, tying this all back, I know you've got a product management background, and a lot of this kind of, it really ties back, it seems to me, at least from what you're saying, to thinking about this almost like building a product, right? And ideally, right? I mean, I know you and I both know that the world doesn't often work this way, but ideally, when you're setting out to build a product, you start with, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve, right?
Yes.
In other words, like what is the
Amen.
thing that, and the candidate in the same thing is like, what's the problem I'm trying to solve for my team, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then once you've got a sense of that, then instead of saying I need to hire a front end developer, right? You're saying what I need are really excellent user experiences, right? And that'd be a designer, a front end developer, or some combination of the two.
Right.
Forces you to go discover broadly potential candidates for them. Cool.
Right.
Couple more questions from the audience here that are coming in, which are really good. So we talked a little bit about culture earlier, right? And I think that this question here is an interesting one, right? How do you avoid falling into a monoculture trap? So if you're hiring for your culture, everyone ends up kind of, wearing the tracksuits and drinking the Kool-Aid and the whole thing, right? Also, and it kind of goes on. Also, what if you're in a transitional state with your culture? If you're moving from a more traditional top-down approach to a flatter or slightly more autonomous product-driven culture, how do you avoid the monoculture trap? That's the big question, I think, here.
Yeah. So that's a super interesting question, and I think I think that what we have to acknowledge now is that, where we are today, kind of in our economy, is that a lot of hiring is just done through referrals, right? And so the first thing you do is acknowledge that referrals are actually going to contribute to the problem of a monoculture. So, I know a lot of people who are similar to me, and I'm going to refer a lot of people who are similar to me. But if you only hire from within your circle, or from the kind of the second tier outside of your circle, you are going to end up with a monoculture. And the way that you kind of break out of that is to be explicit about where you want to go as a culture, how you want to change. And so that's why I created that like dimensions pillar is, when you look at your team, what are you missing? Like, what are you missing? Where are your blind spots that are going to, end up killing you in the market or just giving you a disadvantage? Are there spaces in the marketplace that you may be ignoring or not listening to because you don't have the right people in the room and you don't have the right advocates in the room? So that's the question you need to ask, and then take that. So what I always say to hiring managers is that, everybody kind of thinks about hard and soft skills, but stars are made in dimensions and perspective. That's where you find like the difference maker, the transformative hires. And so pay special attention to the different perspectives that you need on your team. And that's how you break out of that. And so if you kind of outline exactly what you're looking for and what you're missing, and then you apply that to your recruiting process, I think that's really the way to make sure that you're not building a monoculture. And your recruiting process, like, you need to kind of iterate on that, just like everything else, right? So just because most of your successful hires have come from LinkedIn doesn't mean that LinkedIn is the only place, right? So you might want to go to college campuses. You might want to network with different like affinity groups. And you as a hiring manager might need to invest time in expanding your own social network, expanding your own kind of personal network, so that you have access to people who are beyond those now, beyond those people that you went to college with, beyond the people that are instinctively more comfortable for you, right? So hire the unexpected, and I think that's when you start seeing that transformative change. But it takes work to find the unexpected, and you have to kind of look at making investments both in your time and in your recruiting resources to do that. But if your hiring and your interview process isn't responsive to that, you may end up with lots of really interesting job candidates, but they may not get hired if you don't design the process the right way. So you have to be conscious about the entire end-to-end experience.
Got it. Next question from the audience is we're kind of diving back down, kind of super tactical, but this question comes up all the time, and I think it's a good question to ask you, because there are varying opinions on this depending on the type of role. But I'm curious, in the context of the framework that you've been building and sharing and teaching, what about having candidates go through an exercise for the role? So how does that fit in? Does it make sense? Should they do it? What's your take on that?
So this is going to be just like my answer to that question about whether or not a dining experience is a good evaluation tool. It depends on what you're measuring for.
Yeah.
Right. So if I am measuring for financial modeling, then if I want somebody who knows how to build financial models, then to me, I think an exercise really makes a lot of sense, right? And so you just have to think about what you're measuring for and whether or not an exercise will capture that. And what I am always conscious of when designing these exercises is, you want to make sure that like you give people the time. Sometimes, people kind of spring exercises on to candidates real time. And this is, I think, to make sure that, that they don't cheat or something. Yeah. But what you actually end up doing in that situation is you're measuring for something else. You're measuring for, people who can think on their feet, people maybe who are extroverts and who perform well in front of an audience. And so you end up measuring for the wrong thing. And what I encourage people to do is, it's totally okay to do an exercise. Warn the candidate so they can prepare. Give them as much time and material as possible for them to prepare, and acknowledge the fact that there are different personality types that may not respond the same way to these types of challenges. And so be conscious of all of the different things that may come up for people, so that you don't place people at a disadvantage just because they're introverted or just because they don't think well on their feet, right? Like, I like to kind of go and, find a quiet place to do creative thinking, right? And so I maybe wouldn't do that great in an exercise like that. But this actually makes me think about an interview I had back in college where I was so nervous that I couldn't read a graph, even though, I was almost a math major, and so I always think back to that moment and I think, wow, I got so nervous and I froze and I botched the interview. But what were they really measuring for? Like, it wasn't an accurate, or it wasn't a supportive evaluation process.
Yeah, got it. And so interesting thought. And by the way, just the caveat that, at least my background is design. And so it's always the caveat, yes, exercises, but no spec work. In other words, don't have them do free consulting for you. Hey, we're really trying to solve this nitty gritty thing that we haven't been able to do. What do you think, job candidate? Right? It's like, oh yeah, let me do that free consulting for you. Really
and it's okay to pay people for their time too.
Yeah. Right. That's an interesting approach, right? So if you're going to ask me to do a specific thing, pay me my hourly rate, and sure. And then if we like each other, maybe I'll come in full time. That's interesting.
Yeah.
So similar question to this, because it just came in as we were having this exercise conversation. What about portfolios? It's interesting, right? Every time I see portfolios, particularly again as a designer, it's a mixed bag of feelings that I have about them. And I always harken back to a boss I had once who said he didn't care for portfolios because, and this will show you how old this comment is. He said, "I don't care for portfolios because everybody can draw a straight line in Visio." Right.
Amazing.
Right. And so the question to you then is, Visio. What about portfolios? Are they valuable in this process? Is this something that we should include in the evaluation?
I do think portfolios are valuable, but I tend to think about them as not a tool for evaluating the actual work, but for evaluating a person's ability to tell a story and evaluating someone's ability to kind of create a coherent process. Right. So when I am, going through a portfolio with a designer, I don't care that much about the stuff that's in there because, who knows? But what I do care about is their ability to kind of really tell me about, how this happened, why this happened, and what their process was and what their rationale for that process was, right? So that's when, so if I'm looking for somebody who can, tell a story to shareholders or to different stakeholders and customers, then a portfolio is actually a really great tool for that. If I'm looking for someone who can build a design process, who can bring other, other product team members along with that process, actually a portfolio is really good for that. But you have to be conscious of what's actually going on and what you're actually honestly measuring with tools like portfolios.
Got it. Great. Makes total sense. Nicole, that was awesome. Thank you very, very much for sharing your knowledge. Thanks for answering the questions on the fly. Really good questions from the audience. So thanks so much to the audience. Remember, Nicole's book, Hiring for Innovation, is now available for pre-order. You can go to senseandrespondpress.com or bit.ly/Nicole Rufuku, and you can sign up or pre-order the book. It'll be out in just a couple of weeks. Again, thanks so much. If you've got any questions for us, feel free to tweet myself, Sense and Respond Press, or Nicole online with any follow-up questions. Thanks again, and we'll see you all next month. Nicole, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bye, folks.